This is Mr. Griswold. Let's talk apes, Chapter 2. This chapter is going to give us a little overview of the key players in the environmental ballgame, and it's going to give us a little overview of how we've changed as a society over many years. Humans, also known as Homo sapiens, we've been around for about 160,000 years as is. Started out in the European area and African area, Asian area as hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers are people that collect plants, they hunted, they fished, they were nomadic, basically followed their food supply. Lived in small groups, expert knowledge of their surroundings, very slow population growth due to high infant mortality. Infant mortality is when a baby dies before age 1. And they also had a very short life expectancy. If you think about it, obviously not the medical care that we have now, sanitation and things like that. So they just didn't live that long, thus their population stayed quite low. The cultural changes we're going to talk about really start out first with the agricultural revolution, which occurred 10 to 12,000 years ago, which in the grand scheme of things, knowing the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old, that's a really short time. We started out by slashing and burning. As our populations go up, what we're doing is cutting down forests, burning those forests, and then planting crops. Villages started forming. In other words, instead of chasing our food, we're basically growing our own food and the desired food we want. We started monoculture. We'll talk about this when we do agriculture down the road. Monoculture is awful on our environment. Monoculture is growing like one crop. For example, if you drive around Wisconsin, you can see huge cornfields or huge potato fields, huge soybean fields, things like that. That promotes soil erosion, pollution, and of course, if we have more food, we're healthier as a society and our population is going to increase. So that really started our population around the planet. Then we got into an industrial medical revolution, which was about 275 years ago. Started in England in the 1700s. There's famous stories and pictures where people, the regions they were so polluted with non-renewable resources that were being burnt like coal and oil, people couldn't even see across the street. It shifted to the Americas in the 1800s when we got very industrial, particularly out east and all the way into the Midwest region where we are. And at this time, people really started to move to cities. They saw the opportunity. It was easier than farming in some regards where they could make more money quicker. So our cities started to mushroom. And now we're in the last 50 years, in a time called the Information and Globalization Revolution. What this is when we have particularly things like satellite imagery where we can actually see things. Of course, we've got live cameras around the world. We can actually see things going on. So we have a huge awareness of global issues, that should say on there. Kind of looking at the United States history, there's 4 eras that we're going to divide into. The tribal era, which was the basically Native Americans of the United States, very low in environmental impact. Again, very much a hunter-gatherer society, followed the food supply. And they were very promoted sustainable agriculture. In other words, sustainable means leaving enough resources for future populations. They had no need for land ownership at all. It was something very different than we have today. Second era was the frontier, the open frontier. Think about the old cowboys going out west. At this time, the Europeans that came to the United States wanted to conquer that hostile and dangerous land, particularly talking about the Native Americans. And what they wanted to do was go after those resources. The government promoted them to go out west and to get the gold and to get the silver and copper and things like that a nation's economy is based on. Those resources were deemed inexhaustible by many. Of course, we know that isn't the case with many non-renewables, particularly nowadays. They nearly exhausted the bison population. The chapter talks about a case study where people would ride out west and kill bison without respect for future generations. They would actually ride in trains and shoot out the windows at the bison and just let them lay. It was kind of almost like a sport for them, so it was a huge source, almost causing the bison to become extinct. The next era is the conservation era, which occurred 1832 to 1960s. We had key players, one of which was Henry David Thoreau. We'll talk about him later. George Perkins Marsh. 1916, we saw the National Service Act come into existence. In 1933, we had an excellent environmental president, FDR, who actually started this program called the CCC. We'll talk about in a second. Another era that came into play was the environmental era, of which we are in right now. Key players, maybe you've heard of Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring. 1964, we had the Wilderness Act, which actually protected land big time. Couldn't go in and drill oil or farm or cut timber or anything like that. It just really preserved forests around the United States. 1970, a huge step was the Environmental Protection Agency was formed, and from then we had a lot of laws passed that are very active today, like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. We had the Bureau of Land Management formed. Again, things we're going to talk about down the road. 1978, we had the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. We're actually going to stop at this point, and I'll start part 2 of Chapter 2 with key people in a bit.